Many would agree that the China-U.S. relationship is the most important bilateral relationship of our lifetime, but few have clear answers on how to steer it out of the current downward spiral. There has been a strategic competition going on for years, marked by the Obama administration's pivot to Asia and China's more proactive foreign policy. Then, fears of an economic decoupling grew as President Donald Trump launched a trade war with China. Even cultural and people-to-people ties are suffering, with tighter visa restrictions for students and mutual expulsion of journalists. So how did the two countries come to this point? And perhaps more importantly, where is this relationship going? To find out more, I'm joined by Steve Orlins, President of National Committee on U.S.China Relations. That is our topic. This is Dialogue. I'm Wang Guan. Steve, so good to see you. I hope you're safe and healthy under the circumstances. I want to begin by asking you this question. How would you describe the current state of U.S.-China relations?
Well, I guess because I'm well into my third month of quarantine in New York, in Manhattan here, I think of a lot of things in terms of the coronavirus and the pandemic and hospitalization and ICUs, intensive care units, and I would say that the U.S.-China relationship is in the intensive care unit. It's deeply troubled. The analogy I would make is it's deeply troubled, and where's the doctor? Who is going to pull us out of this downward spiral? What seems to be happening is we're seeing tit for tat, and it gets worse. And it gets worse. We see misinformation emanating from the U.S. government. We've seen misinformation emanating from the Chinese government. We've seen expulsions of journalists by the U.S. government. We've seen expulsions of journalists by the Chinese government. We're seeing tightening of export controls on goods from the United States to China. We're seeing all sorts of negative developments. So the question I keep asking myself is, who are the adults who are the doctors who are basically going to stand up and say, wait a minute, this relationship is too important to allow it to deteriorate this way?
And then, do you think it is safe to say that America's long-held engagement policy with China is now dead? What were the milestone events that led to its end?
Many believe that it's dead. I don't. I don't believe it's dead. I believe, actually, that from an American's point of view, for virtually my entire life, one of the great successes of American foreign policy has been engagement with China. We've seen extraordinary economic growth in China, in the United States. We've seen both societies benefit from this policy of engagement. For a variety of reasons, the peoples in both countries, the leadership have turned on engagement, have decided that engagement hasn't reached the results that we hoped it would. Some people in the United States believe that engagement would change China's political system. Look, I've been dealing with China for 40 years. I did not believe that it would change China's political system. I did believe that engagement with China would make the Chinese economy more open, more free, more subject to market forces. And you know what? It has. Is it satisfactory from a U.S. business point of view or from a U.S. government point of view? No. But when I look at when I first arrived in 1979 and now, the progress has been enormous. So we've lost sight of that. And so many in Washington are declaring engagement dead. Well, it's not dead. And in fact, it's succeeded. And what we need to recognize is that on the margins, we need to change U.S.-China relations. But on the core issues, the fundamental issues, we've actually been remarkably successful. And we need to continue those policies. So what we need are people to stand up and for leaders to stand up and say, yes, the two governments don't share the same values, But the core interests of the American people and the core interests of the Chinese people do not conflict, and we need to find ways to work together.
Well, Steve, you know what? It seems that the U.S. and China are going on this downward spiral. There has been an all-out, if not an all-out confrontation, but confrontation on many fronts. Do you still think that the U.S. and China can still escape this Thucydides trap?
Yes, absolutely. You know, again, because I've been working at this a long time, if in 1970, when I was starting the studying of Chinese, people would have said that, you know, Secretary Kissinger and President Nixon would get on a plane and meet with Chairman Mao and Zhou Enlai, and we would have this extraordinary breakthrough. People would have said, oh, come on, that's not going to happen. But in fact, it happened, and it led to these 5 decades of peace and stability. What we need is leadership. What we need is the leadership that Mao and Zhou and Kissinger and Nixon showed. What we need is the leadership that Deng Xiaoping and President Carter demonstrated when I was in the U.S. State Department. They demonstrated that they overcame, in effect, the domestic political opposition to do what was right for the two peoples in the long term. So what we need now is leaders in both countries who stand up and say, we need to find the areas where we can cooperate. The SNED has basically been the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, which existed under President Bush, which existed under President Obama, now has fallen by the wayside. So that we should recreate that. We should have a venue where senior government officials from both sides talk about these many, many issues that are deeply troubling the U.S.-China relationship. The two countries can't talk to each other through media. They need to talk to each other directly. We should find where the conflicting areas are and where we can solve them. But we shouldn't take the conflicting areas and make that the focus of the relationship. Because in truth, as we're seeing now, what the real existential threats to the United States and China, the real existential threats are pandemic. It's very, very difficult. That is an existential threat. Terrorism is an existential threat. Climate change is an existential threat. And we're seeing now that economic crisis, the economic crisis, we didn't expect the pandemic would lead to this extraordinary economic crisis, but the economic crisis are existential threats to China and the United States. And when we cooperate, we can deal with these economic threats. When we kind of go our own ways, don't cooperate, decouple, tighten export controls where it doesn't make any sense anymore, where it's going way beyond any definition of national security, then these economic crises are going to be prolonged, not shortened. I frequently use the quote of one of my heroes, Martin Luther King, and in his last speech, when he talked about the promised land, he said, when it's darkest, you can see the stars. When it's darkest, you can see the stars. This is the darkest
great. Hopefully
that the U.S.-China relationship has been
remembered by
in my life.
Policymakers. Yeah. Finally, Steve, before we let you go, your prediction on where China-U.S. relations will be headed, both in the short term and in the long term?
In the short term, we're in for a rough road. You know, as I said earlier, the Trump administration has decided to deflect attention from its mishandling of the coronavirus to saying it was all China's fault. So over the next 5.5 months, we will see a lot of bashing of China. The Biden campaign and they will also attack Biden as being, quote, soft on China. The Biden campaign has decided to inoculate itself against that attack by saying they're even tougher on China than the Trump campaign, than Trump is. And they'll point to, Trump praising Xi Jinping, Trump saying Xi is doing a magnificent job on handling the pandemic, and it will be a competition as who can be tougher on China. So that's going to make, what you were talking about, the public narrative on China even more difficult. It will be a very negative discussion. What I think in the long term is the issues that I think matter, that bring Americans and Chinese together, will slowly rise to the top. And the people will demand that we have constructive U.S.-China relations, that we don't have this strategic competition which wastes resources, kills Americans, and kills Chinese. And that ultimately that will become where the governments have to go, because the people will demand it. So short-term, very negative. Long-term, very positive. And we will get back to a constructive U.S.-China relationship because the people will demand it. It's what makes their lives better, safer, and more prosperous.
Steve Orleans, President of National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Thank you so much for your time. Coming up, I will be talking to Cheng Li, Director of John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. Stay with us. Now back to the big question. Given these different and sometimes opposing dynamics, where are U.S.-China relations headed? I don't have all the answers, but I know someone who might. Dr. Cheng Li is the director of the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution. He's also a director of the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations. Dr. Li, so good to see you.
Happy to see you here.
You've followed U.S.-China relations for decades. How would you characterize the current state of this relationship?
I would call a vicious cycle of 3 rings or 3 areas. All start with the word D. The first is devastating coronavirus situation in the United States. And number 2 is bipartisan infighting in U.S. presidential election. And number 3 is a dangerous deterioration of U.S.-China relations. Also, we know that both Democrat Party and Republican Party recently released the presidential election advertisement, the TV, both of them about 2 minutes or so. But also interesting enough, they both use China as a theme to criticize the other side to be too soft and regarding China. Of course, that in the recent couple of weeks, the Democratic Party sounds like they are still searching for a new strategy. They don't want to follow President Donald Trump to blame everything to China, therefore reduce his own responsibility. But nevertheless, I think the entire atmosphere is very critical of China, rightly or wrongly from the American perspective. And finally, the dangerous deterioration of U.S.-China relations. Now, there are many factors, but as we know that in the United States, some scholars, including my colleague at the Brookings, they talk about geopolitical landscape change. And Kurt Campbell and his co-author, Raj Dash, wrote a piece in Foreign Affairs in March saying that American Suez Canal moment sounds like the U.S. lost its global leadership position. So that certainly enhanced anxiety and concern. And for China, they think this is all part of the American conspiracy against China to contain China's rise. Even that some politicians in the United States want to pursue regime change. So you can see China is determined to fight back from that kind of their thinking. So it's becoming increasingly zero-sum game mindset. Now all these 3 areas, or what I call 3 rings, reinforce each other. So we are in a situation, it's really unprecedented.
And I want to get your predictions on where U.S.-China relations are headed, both in the short term and in the long term?
Well, short term, I think that you probably should not expect too much changes. This is kind of, election season will reinforce this kind of tensions or criticism. Now, for the long term, I would say probably will be a little bit different. We're still in the early stage, maybe the coronavirus epidemic. People are concerned about the whole things will move to south, the southern hemisphere, and the later developing countries, probably later income, low income countries may probably also be hit severely. But also we talk about the second wave. Now, with this kind of things going on, I think people's mindset may change because regardless of how you define that the coronavirus, this is certainly is a historical moment. To a certain extent, is the humanitarian crisis in our lifetime. So people's view may change. Now, this reminds me, Martin Wolf, the famous writer for Financial Times, he was once asked 2 years ago, what can change this kind of deterioration of U.S.China relations? At that time, he said, unless that the Mars invaded the Earth. But the coronavirus is something very much similar to this kind of challenge. So the real enemy is neither China nor United States from the other side, but really the common enemy, which is the virus. So that requires international cooperation.
Talking about U.S.-China cooperation on COVID-19, do you see a window of opportunity right now for both countries to work together to fight this common enemy?
I do. If you look at the medical professions in the United States, majority of them really emphasize the cooperation, and many medical experts and public policy, public health experts actually acknowledge some of the progress made in China. In my observation, reflect that most of the medical doctors, and also they appreciate sharing information, and also some of the move from China and also from many other countries. So I think that this kind of international cooperation it's the way we should enhance rather than reduce. So that gives us a hope. Mm-hmm. Now, besides that, but also I think it's very importantly, this coronavirus makes us realize that we live in the same world. It's so closely connected. So international public good, whether it be climate change, to deal with the common challenge of international refugees, and also the drug traffics, and the cyber security, energy security, and nuclear non-proliferation, and most importantly, cooperation on the public health, such as right now. I think all these things will be a positive force, push for cooperation. So in that regard, for kind of a medium term or long term, I'm actually optimistic.
And then how do you assess the current U.S.-China security relations? What are the biggest risk factors?
Well, the biggest risk factor certainly is Taiwan. I think that because the recent resolution in the U.S. Congress, Taiwan Act 2019, is a close move to, sounds like, acknowledge Taiwan as a nation state. So certainly this is challenging China's bottom line. Now, I also noticed there's some interesting discussion in China among the policy or intellectual circle, talk about the times on the China side. China should be restrained, should not be unnecessary, too provocative or overreact. Now, that's actually, I think it's a healthy discussion in my view. But I think I don't know that how much restraint China will continue to play. But from U.S. side, I mean, many people also critical about what happened in terms of China's exercise in South China Sea, maybe some of the exercise in East China Sea, and the cyber security issues, and etc. These are all very contentious issues. And of course, I do not want to present, I want to be objective. I think both sides have some very concern. The truth is they were very close to some of the conflict, sometimes maybe based on incidents like what happened a year ago, that the Navy ships in both countries are very, very close, about only 47 meters away. Now, As Dr. Kissinger said, warned us last November, first in New York in the National Committee's meeting, then in Bloomberg conference in Beijing, he said U.S.-China relations were at the foothills of the new Cold War. He said if it's not carefully managed, could be devastating as what happened in the World War I. Now, recently he also wrote a piece in the Wall Street Journal about in early April, also talked about if without restraint, the whole things will be out of control. Now, he did not name countries, but I think it's very much in his mind about the U.S.-China relations. Now, a friend of mine who went to Princeton with me, Zheng Yongyan, you probably, people in China are very familiar with his writing. He also said in history, the war and the pandemics is usually hand in hand like twin brothers. Now, of course, I don't want to give it sensationalism. The war scenario is maybe only 5 to 10%. For those of us working the area as scholars, as opinion leaders, should be learned by some recent development, as I described earlier, as a vicious cycle of 3 rings. But we should find kind of a mechanism to prevent these things happen. We should and must to prevent this very dangerous situation. So that's a security domain, and I think that we do need to pay attention to the danger.
And people like to describe economic and finance ties between the two countries as an anchor of this relationship. Do you think that is still the case? Can the political winds blow this anchor off at some point, or have they?
Well, I think that the metaphor of anchor is the right one. This also reminds me that Jack Ma said a couple of years ago. He said, "When trade stops, a war will begin." Now, unfortunately, that some people in the United States want to have the completed decoupling, and certainly that the trade tensions and still on the rise. President Donald Trump is certainly preoccupied with some other issues. That explains he now become very, very critical of China. A few days ago, he said that we could completely cut off with China. So that kind of message certainly resonated badly. Even Chinese leaders wanted to do some deal with them. They will be hesitant, and it sent the wrong signal to people in the world, especially to people in China. So it enhanced the animosity between two countries. Now, so in that regard, unfortunately, trade could not play the role they could. But still, I think we should not let the decoupling really happen. I think good things is a lot of foreign companies. Still, there are about 70,000 American companies doing business with China. Many of them also have their offices or branches in China. So we do not see the large-scale withdrawal. Now, the point is that I think improvement of U.S.-China relation, you cannot go without the strong bonds of ties, economic ties, such as the term, the anchor you mentioned. But on the other hand, the relationship really, in the future, the next development should not be just driven by business, because there's some growing concern, I think, particularly in the United States. They think only Wall Street, only corporate America benefited from that. The middle class could not benefit from that. So they even be more critical about doing business with China. So that's why President Donald Trump's blame China game can have some public support. But so I think the driving force should come from somewhere else. The mindset change I already mentioned is important, but the more important is the recognition, the shared interest, and the common cause.
Dr. Li, I remember you and I talking about this, a potential technology war, and you said you were very worried back then. Are you more worried right now that a technology code war may happen? Think about Huawei, think about China Telecom, think about impeded access.
Well, I think that issue will not be resolved so easily, even with a new president in the White House, after November. I think that related with some the centerpiece of the competition. United States always enjoy its leadership, its supremacy in that area. But now they found that in some crucial area, of course, the United States is a very, very strong country on the economic, technological front. But in some of the areas like 5G, like artificial intelligence, some people, including senators, and like Senator Rubio said that in a few years, maybe 10 years, maybe even now, China already surpassed the United States. So this kind of anxiety will not disappear, especially in the American discourse. They think that China could undermine American security. So that debate will not, of course, different people have different views, and maybe it's overreacted. My view is, I think both China and United States should share probably the technology superpower, co-superpower in that regard for a long time, because no one side could defeat the other side. This is my view. But it's a painful adjustment. You need to find the more area for cooperation. But I think there's some legitimate reason for United States to talk about intellectual property rights. But at the same time, also, U.S. should realize that in some areas, for example, 5G, that the United States does not provide alternative for some other country. U.S. wanted them to stop doing business with Huawei or with Chinese companies, because U.S. should provide the alternative. So if you cannot provide alternative, you cannot blame, like some of my colleagues, like Evan Arsenault, the author of New Yorker, he said, if you cannot provide the alternative, so you cannot also blame this is China stealing your technology. And so in that regard, I think the best thing for the United States to improve its own technology competitiveness. The same thing with China. I think China needs to also improve transparency and its own confidence and its own technology development. But ultimately, I do not see this area as really zero-sum game, because we are in the area the information and technology should be shared. But unfortunately, we caught up in such kind of zero-sum game mindset. It will take some time or lessons for people to learn to change that mindset.
Dr. Cheng Li, Director of the John L. Thornton China Center at the Brookings Institution, thank you so much for your insight. It was so good to have you.
Thank you.